So I'm glad you're all here. NG Upgrade has a really special place in my heart because it sort of ended up being my main focus over the last couple of years. And what I really like about it is that it's a really painful subject for people. So even though it's becoming less popular of a topic at conferences, it's every single place I go that I give a talk, whether it's on NG Upgrade or not. If it's an Angular conference, I always have people coming up to me and asking questions about this problem because it's such a massive issue that people are still working through. Um, and it's really gratifying just because I think there's like an emotional component to this that people resonate with that they don't for other just like hip tech things, because you're actually like dealing with this really painful issue. Um, so this is a picture of Olympic National Forest, um, and I took this picture with a friend of mine, a really old friend of mine that I went to high school with, um, and he moved to Los Angeles. And back in September, he messaged me and was like, "Hey, um, I want to go camping in Olympic National Forest, and I know you've been learning about this stuff. Do you want to come with me?" And when I moved to Portland in 2014, I had never camped or hiked or anything before because uh, I grew up in the South. And if you know anything about Florida, um, you know that it's generally speaking a really bad idea to hang out outside for more than a few minutes unless you're next to some water somewhere, because it's hot and humid and miserable and full of mosquitoes. So I had spent several years in Portland learning about camping and hiking, and took a bunch of like wilderness classes, like survival classes, things like that. And so this trip with my best friend from high school last year was like a really nice capstone where like he was a total novice, and all of a sudden I found myself teaching him about camping and hiking and things like that. And what really made things click for me when I was learning about backpacking and wilderness survival and stuff like that was when I realized that it's kind of a decision tree. Like when you're planning a trip, you start thinking in terms of this decision tree of like, okay, how many days am I going? How much food do I need? What kind of water sources are nearby? And that systematizing, I think because I'm a programmer, that systematizing really helped me. And that, to bring this full circle, that is kind of what I've learned with NG Upgrade. That there's actually this, well, not just NG Upgrade, but migration broadly from AngularJS to Angular is like there's this decision tree that you can learn to figure out what the right path is for you. The hard part is that the first migration is the hardest, but most people only do one. So you don't have the benefit of experience when you tackle this problem. So what I want to do is kind of walk you through this decision tree with a couple of example companies, and just that are based on my own experience and the experience of either people I've met or consulting clients or things like that, and kind of walk you through this process of how you figure out which migration strategy to use. So I'm Sam Julien. Um, I'm on Twitter and Twitch and places like that at Sam Julien. I also write a lot at samjulien.com. I write about my journey of self-improvement and becoming a self-taught developer and DevRel and things like that, um, and send out a newsletter and things like that. And then this picture is of me on the final survival wilderness trip of this class that I took, this like 9-month program where we lived on a mountain in the snow for 5 days with only like food that we hunted for or brought from other places. It was quite an experience. Um, so for this little thought experiment, we're going to use two example companies. We're going to use Noble Nonprofit, which is based on my former job before I started Auth0, and Stable Insurance, which is based on an amalgam of other people I've talked to and consulting clients and things like that. And so in this talk, I'm gonna make two assumptions as we get started. The first one is that I'm just gonna go ahead and assume that you need to migrate. there are lots of good reasons not to migrate from AngularJS. Those being mostly that if you're no longer doing any sort of feature development at all, if your application is just kind of humming along with no risk of ever needing to be worked on again, you may not need to migrate. So I'm just going to assume that you've already been down that road and you need to. I'm also going to assume that you want to migrate to Angular here. Like, I'm not going to get into why you might move from AngularJS to React or Vue or things like that. There's also good reasons to do that too. But in this talk, we're just going to assume that you've already decided that you need to move from AngularJS to Angular, and you're trying to figure out how. And we'll have plenty of time for questions. So if you want to get more into these two assumptions, I'd be happy to talk about that stuff. So generally speaking, there are roughly 4 paths to migration, sort of four canonical paths. The first one is just rewriting. This is sometimes referred to as Big Bang, or like the Big Bang approach. Sometimes also I refer to it as burn everything to the ground and start over. But this is essentially where you're just rewriting your application from scratch into Angular. The second path is ngUpgrade. ngUpgrade is probably what most people are most familiar with at this point, where it's a library created by the Angular team that is part of Angular, the new Angular, Angular 2+. And it's a library that lets you run both AngularJS and Angular at the same time in your app. And there are a couple different ways of doing this, but that's sort of the broad approach. There's another route called hybrid routing, and there's a couple flavors of this. There's sort of 4 broad paths, but they end up, in the real world, kind of bleeding over into each other or being a little nuanced. But hybrid routing, generally speaking, means that one route is being controlled by one framework. So that could either be on the client side using ngUpgrade, where you have both the AngularJS router and the Angular router working together, or it could be on the server side, where you essentially are running 2 apps and splitting out some routes that hit the AngularJS side and some that are hitting the Angular side. I almost like to think of this as more like 3.5 paths, but there's such a different approach to doing ngUpgrade or migration, where you go this hybrid routing, that I kind of break it out into its own. And then the last one is Angular Elements. With Angular Elements, if you don't know, are web components. So they're sort of like tiny Angular applications that you can, it can be even one component that you can then drop into any JavaScript, including AngularJS, that you can sort of upgrade your app component by component. And the Angular team has provided some nice hooks between AngularJS and Angular Elements that you wouldn't get if you were using Angular Elements with like Backbone or jQuery or something like that, to upgrade those. So that's a fourth approach. So there are a number of different, I mentioned this sort of like flowchart or decision trees, and there are a number of different factors that you want to consider when you're thinking through which of these paths you want to take. And not all of them have to do with code, interestingly enough. And this is for the migration thing, but this is also, if you think about it, also sort of a team architecture, any sort of large scale migration, you're going to have to think about these things. So let's start with your team and kind of think that through. Probably the most obvious factor you want to consider here with your team is the size of your team. How many people do you have that can do this work with you? So let's look at our 2 example companies here. At Noble Nonprofit, we've got 4 developers that are working on 2 medium apps, and these are, healthy complexity apps, not just sort of to-do lists. Because they're so small, they can do a lot of coordination. You know, they can walk over to each other's desk. Well, I guess not anymore, but they can IM each other on Skype for Business or whatever, and you know, coordinate and make sure they're not working on the same thing at the same time. And then because this is a smaller group, they don't have any extra dollars for consulting. You know, they're not going to be bringing in a SWAT team of experts to do this work for them. So it's these four and nobody else, basically. And then you have, on the other hand, you have an insurance company, stable insurance company. Just in this one section of the company, this one department, you've got 70 developers that are hammering on 8 giant applications. And because it's a big team, it's working at scale, they're going to need a lot of autonomy when they're working on things. They can't be worried about stepping on each other's toes and committing at the same time and all that. They also need a lot of automation here because of that. But because they're a bigger company with more resources and probably more revenue at risk, which is a thing we have to consider with migration, they do have the ability to bring on some outside consultants. So in this sense, the nonprofit is limited in their human resources, and the insurance company really isn't. You know, for all intents and purposes, it's not really limited in what how many people they can throw at this. The other one is capacity. This is actually another important thing that people want to know, because with the rewrite option, for example, the problem is, well, how can we possibly just drop everything and rewrite this application from scratch? There's no way. That's, you know, for a lot of companies, that's just not even a possibility. So we want to look at the capacity. How much time do you have to dedicate to this problem, to this refactor, whatever path you choose? So at the nonprofit, for example, because they're small and they're a nonprofit, they have a lot of control over how much. So this is actually based on my last boss at my last job in Portland was an insanely good manager, and he somehow negotiated this with the powers that be, that we would have 30% of our time we could allot to technical debt, and then I think we did like 50% or 60% on feature development and the rest on production bugs or something like that. And so we had this nice chunk of time that we could put towards technical debt and things like that. The only problem is that when you have a small team and you're operating at such a high capacity, there's a lot greater chance of burnout there, because you start working on these big refactors. They take a lot of mental energy, and so we found ourselves really struggling as we're putting so much time into this. And so that pace of the migration is something that you want to consider there. On the other hand, at the insurance company, as you would imagine, they don't have any control over their capacity planning. It happens at such a high level, you know, compared to the devs in the basement. For some reason, I feel like at these big companies, devs are always in the basement. So they've got, you know, 10% allotted to technical debt, no more, no less. But because they're a bigger group, that 10% is gonna go a lot farther because they have a lot more people working on it. So those are factors to take into consideration. The last thing that you want to consider with the actual team is just the levels of experience, and this could be experience just in terms of, you know, general developer experience, whether, you know, senior versus junior. It could also be experience with the frameworks, the different frameworks that are involved, because that will matter. So on the one hand, you've got years of experience. Obviously, an architect or a staff engineer is going to approach a problem differently than a junior developer. So we have to take that into account. And then also the expertise. So if somebody has been trucking along with AngularJS, but they don't know anything about Angular and nothing about RxJS, that's obviously going to impact things differently than if somebody sort of had one foot in both camps over the last few years. So at the nonprofit, for example, you've got 2 senior developers, a mid-level developer, and a junior developer. But of those, you've got an Angular developer, you know, somebody who's been kind of already prototyping and getting involved in Angular and RxJS and things like that. And then you've got an AngularJS developer, you know, who's sort of just been set doing the same things, knows AngularJS backwards and forwards. But then, forgot to mention that two of these developers are actually back-end developers. They're C# developers. And it doesn't, for our purposes, let's pretend, for example, that one of the senior developers was a back-end and the junior developer, right? So you've got a mid-level developer and a senior developer who are in the front end, and the other two are back-end. And a lot of times in these smaller companies, you do have this. I'm actually like literally right now working on a consulting project with someone, and the main guy who's going to be doing their migration is mostly a C# developer. He's not, and so he's good enough with AngularJS, but somehow now this work is on him to do the most of the migration. So this is something that will affect your decision process here. On the other hand, you have, as you would imagine at a big insurance company or something, you'd have a really wide range of experience, but at the same time, usually in these kinds of companies, you don't have a lot of autonomy in what you're learning and what you're working on. Like I remember working at a financial company a few years back, we had so much technical debt and so much legacy code that the idea of experimenting with new technologies was kind of laughable, because we were just constantly behind the 8 ball with like refactoring SQL triggers to be C# endpoints and things like that. And so, so a lot more narrow focus, even though we have a wider group of people to work with. So if we kind of work through that and think through, like, just without even looking at the code, what kind of options might work in these different scenarios when you've got these vastly different, you can see how this migration process, it's so gnarly because there's so many factors involved. And so like for the nonprofit, they're probably, because they have a higher degree of flexibility and more time to devote to it, and sort of a smaller group that can hammer away on these things, they're probably going to start looking at either rewriting from scratch or using ng upgrade, sort of out of the box ng upgrade. That might work for them. It's a little bit less clear for the insurance company. They know off the bat that rewriting is probably a ludicrous idea for like a big application in an insurance company. But then these other three, it's kind of harder to narrow this down at this point. And so now we've sort of gotten some of those human elements off the table, and now we can start looking at the actual code base to kind of pinpoint what we want to do. So from the code standpoint, the first thing we want to look at is the architecture of the application, or applications, whatever the case may be. So one of the things we want to look at here is how modernized is the AngularJS application? Where does it, because we know that with AngularJS, right, eventually John Papa's style guide came along, but if you've been around AngularJS for a long time, it didn't start that way. It was an evolving ecosystem where one of the biggest problems with this migration is that there's so many different starting points. You could be working on AngularJS 1.2 and then, using $scope everywhere versus like 1.7 and components and things. So you want to take that into account. So you might remember, hopefully you can see this since we're in a remote meeting. You might remember architecture like this, where you've got a controllers folder, a directives folder, a factories folder, and then, $scope everywhere. We're not using controller as syntax. This is sort of the old school AngularJS way of doing things. Obviously, that's a vastly different starting point than if you're using Webpack and modules and controller as syntax, things like that. So we want to take that into account as we're looking at this. So for example, at the nonprofit, they've been watching this happen over the last few years. So they've been preparing their code. Oh, I need to update this slide to say 1.7. Well, no, I think 1.6 is actually more realistic. So they've been preparing their code already. So they're really aligned with John Papa's style guide. They're using components instead of controllers. They're using, they've converted all of their directives that they can also to components. So they're kind of like ready to go here with this. They're also using a more modern version, almost the latest version, AngularJS 1.6, the latest being 1.7. So they don't have a lot of, prep work. Whereas, Stable Insurance, because it's such a big company, they've got a lot of these older practices, a lot of old versions of AngularJS that are out there, a lot of shared libraries, component library or code libraries and things like that they've got to patch together. The next factor that you want to take into account is the build process. Once you've kind of figured out where you're at with the actual AngularJS code. And this is probably the most important piece of this whole thing is the build process. If you get the build process right in the migration, then other things will kind of fall into place. So it's important that you look at, take a hard look at where you're at. And the two big axes that you want to look at are where you're at in the spectrum of regular ES5, ES 2015, or ES6, whatever you want to call it, and then TypeScript. So if you're using vanilla ES5, that's obviously going to be a different prospect than if you're already using TypeScript with AngularJS. It also means that your build system is probably going to look different. So are you using something like a task runner like gulp or grunt to concatenate and minify everything? Or are you on the ES6 module train using Webpack, or maybe you're even already starting to use the Angular CLI for some things as you're starting the migration? So these are things that you want to take into consideration here. And setting this up will be something that's going to impact the rest of your migration. So for example, at the nonprofit, they've already set up Gulp. They've got Gulp going, and they've set up Gulp with Babel so that they can use ES6. So they're already using some ES 2015, ES6 stuff that's going to make it a little bit smoother as they're trying to move to TypeScript and things like that. Their build process is also very standard. They're just concatenating and minifying and using sort of the normal things you would think of to build a production app. But then you've got things like in the insurance company, they probably have kind of a smattering. They've got some that are just using script tags, literally just adding script tags to an index.html page to include everything. Some that might be using a task runner like Gulp or Grunt. And a lot of their code is just vanilla ES5, At the same time, they also have a very complex system that they have to work this into, where it's, got to go through security checks and deployment process and things like that, that they have a much bigger pipeline that they have to deal with. And so that'll probably play into how they decide to do this. Another really important factor that you want to take into account as you're deciding where to go in migration is testing. And unfortunately, I don't have this isn't a very positive story. And in fact, guys on this call are smiling, I can see, because they actually talked to me about this at ngConf last year. So you really want to take a look at the state of your unit testing and your end-to-end testing, because one thing that you run into here is that if you're trying to use ngupgrade, for example, you're going to be using 2 dependency injection systems and 2 change detection systems. You'll be having AngularJS and Angular with ngupgrade. They run together. They run side by side. And for the most part, I mean, they work well in the app. It's all been hammered out to where they're working together in the application. But when you get to setting up unit tests, things get really complicated. And so you want to take a look at like how many unit tests you've got, what pieces of the application you're testing, how dependent you are on unit testing versus, human regression testing, things like that. This is another area where TypeScript really comes into play too. Like I've found that implementing TypeScript eliminated a lot of my unit tests in AngularJS, because a lot of my unit tests in AngularJS were like, did this thing get injected into this other thing and did the app run? And of course, with TypeScript, that'll all go away because, TypeScript won't work if you're not doing that right. So most of the unit tests start to drill down into more business logic and testing public APIs and things like that. There's a specific resource on unit testing that I'll mention here, which is Pete Bacon-Darwin added some helpers into Angular for testing these ng upgrade scenarios. And if I think of it, I'll try to add that link to something. I think I wrote an article about it or something at some point. I'll find some links for that. The other thing you want to take into account is if you're using Protractor for your end-to-end tests, which you likely are, versus something like Cypress. And this is another area where, unfortunately, I don't have very good news for you, because Protractor does this thing. Since Protractor hooks into the change detection cycles, it's not kind of Protractor is not really a pure end-to-end testing framework, meaning that it actually needs to know things about the code that it's running on. Oh, Sean posted the Angular help, the ng upgrade testing helpers in the chat if anybody's interested. So Protractor needs to hook into the change detection systems of both AngularJS and Angular when it's running in this hybrid mode. And that can cause a lot of weird stuff to happen with your end-to-end tests. Usually what the cause of this is that some sort of dependency is outside of your control, triggering the AngularJS digest cycle, which is then triggering a zone detection in Angular, and they're getting in this weird infinite loop that Protractor can't understand, and so it collapses under its own weight. And so this can be solved. It's a very painful debugging process, but sometimes you can't solve it. And so it's something that you need to be aware of, and you need to evaluate whether you want to continue to use Protractor and try to figure that out versus migrating over to something like Cypress, which is completely agnostic of what's happening in the JavaScript. I have a preference for something like Cypress, but there are downsides to it because it's not running on something like Selenium. It's actually using JavaScript. So there are some native things that it can't catch. So that's definitely a factor that you want to take into account. So, for example, the way this comes into play is that at Noble Nonprofit, they've got some unit tests, but they're not, nothing. The world's not going to end if those unit tests are temporarily broken. And they also have sort of dabbled with Protractor, but it's also not a huge deal. They also have a lot more potential for more acceptance testing. They've got humans that are writing regression tests, and even though that's not ideal, that's something they can fix as they're migrating. They can add Cypress tests and more unit tests in Angular and things like that, and it's just not worth addressing that technical debt at this point. But then on the flip side, usually at a big insurance company, you're going to have a lot of unit tests, a lot of Protractor tests. You don't have the hours to have humans manually regress these things. And so, I've talked to one company that they had like 500 Protractor tests. So I couldn't just be like, yeah, just migrate to Cypress, no big deal. They actually had to sit there and like work through how they were going to deal with that. And that's a painful enough problem to where you would hate to get far along in the migration and realize that you had that problem and then have to roll things back because you couldn't fix that issue. So things to think about there. I think I forgot to mention with the unit testing, my one recommendation would be as much as you can to try to only test things that are purely in one framework or the other. If you can manage it. The hiccups always come when you're trying to do things like inject Angular services into AngularJS or mix and match components and things like that, which are all kind of the reason we use ngUpgrade for that ability. But the unit testing for some reason is just a massive pain with that. So if we go back and look at this again, knowing what we know now, the nonprofit, they're sort of the prime candidate for ngUpgrade. ngUpgrade tends to work really well. It has this sweet spot of like medium to large applications that don't take a lot of prep work and are kind of on their way. They've been well maintained. They're on their way to, they may not be super modernized, but they're not going to be like, it's not going to be this massive undertaking because, you're using very, very outdated practices and things like that. You don't have to do a lot of work to bring it up to speed. so ngUpgrade works really well in that scenario. Um, it can work in other cases for that. Sometimes it's still the best option when you're outside of that sweet spot. But there's it was really designed for like this really clear, happy path of migration. Um, the insurance company, on the other hand, they're probably going to want to do something more along the lines of the hybrid routing or Angular elements. And these are two, they would probably use the hybrid routing that still uses ngUpgrade, but they could get in there and see, depending on what their backend looked like and things like that, what makes the most sense. But the reason for that is they're probably going to want to keep their framework separate. They're not going to want, there's too much overhead to where trying to get it to the point, trying to solve enough technical debt to get AngularJS and Angular talking to each other and working in tandem is probably not worth it when in the long run they're just going to have to convert the whole thing, or they're going to have to leave it. This is another thing that's a very common issue, is a lot of times you start these migrations and they might be in the hybrid state for years. It's just the way it is. It's a big process. And so they'll probably want to do something like either have a router outlet for AngularJS and a router outlet for Angular, and so they touch at the top of the application and then never again. They don't ever talk to each other, and they want to kind of migrate one feature at a time and not try to have any sort of shared dependencies or things like that. They'll have a little bit more code reuse in that method, but it'll probably be balanced out by not having to deal with as many headaches. Angular Elements is a good approach, but I will tell you that it requires a lot of off-roading, because the tooling for Angular Elements is still really being developed. There's a lot of it was on hold for Ivy, and so now that Ivy's done, we'll probably see some more development on Angular Elements and the tooling surrounding it. But the companies that tend to be using this are big, giant banks that can afford to hire a SWAT team of developers to build out their own kind of custom tooling and custom setup for these things. So I would be wary of jumping right into Elements at this current stage, unless you've got a lot of resources and time. I think it's very promising as an approach. And if you are in that scenario where you've just got just a massively complex application and, a lot of really smart people or a lot of money to hire more smart people, then Elements is a cool approach for that. There are a lot of resources and tools out there. Unfortunately, some are still being actively worked on and some aren't. And so I'll kind of give you a little bit of a survey on these things. So Josh just posted the Capital One. They've been documenting. They're sort of the poster child right now for using Angular Elements in a migration. And so keep that level in mind. We're talking about a multinational billion-dollar company or something that can hire really smart people to work on this stuff for them. So one tool, and unfortunately, I don't think it's still being developed. Alana Olson, who was an intern at Google, or sort of has a recurring internship at Google, made this migration assistant. I haven't tried it with Angular 9. Well, actually, I guess it's probably not dependent on Angular. It's kind of a cool thing where she runs all of those factors that I mentioned. She factors in those and runs through your AngularJS and spits out an input of you're using $root scoop over here, you're using controllers over here. So I would recommend, it's no longer under the Angular repo, it's under Alana's personal, but it's a neat tool just to kind of get a feel for the complexity and size of your application and things like that. Along those same lines, Alana, when she was at Google, created this migration forum where she started compiling resources on the migration process. I don't think she's actively working on it, but both of these things are things that I think are still valid for the migration process, and might be opportunities for other people to contribute if they want to work with her on any of those things or contribute to them. But there's still a lot of really good information on this migration wiki and forum. There's a number of articles on all the different paths and sort of a central repository for trying to um, make this knowledge available to more people. And then, of course, I mean, shameless plug, but my course, Upgrading AngularJS, is on the ng upgrade process itself. So I don't talk about hybrid routing or Angular elements or anything like that in my course. It's all about ng upgrade. It's shamelessly, I will say, I think it's the best out there on ng upgrade. It is still, I'm getting ready to do some content updating to it. It's gotten, it's still getting people into ng upgrade. The concepts are all still relevant. Some of the syntax I need to update a little bit, but it's still a really good resource. And if you end up, buying the course, you're gonna get. I always give all the updates for free. So even if I do a big course update later this year, you'll always get the updates for free. I also, another shameless plug, I also have started doing some remote consulting. For example, I've been doing some of this with Aaron Frost for Hero Devs. We will do like a remote 1 day, planning session where we'll walk through your architecture and walk through your build process and record it all and give you the videos and help sort these things out for you. So your company does have need for that kind of consulting, I'm available for that. Outside of any of those resources, I've got some other articles linked here, and I'll make these slides available. There's Manfred has, if you don't know Manfred Steyer, he's in Austria, I think, but he wrote a really great article on migrating without doing all of the prep work of an existing code base. So it kind of used to be that we thought that you needed to get all of your code up to speed and modernize before you could even start the migration. And it turns out that's not really the case. And so Manfred wrote a nice article about that. There are a few resources. I should have added my own. There's a few resources on Angular Elements, one of which is I built a talk for NDC London on migrating with Angular Elements, and I forgot to add it to this slide, but I'll do that. But Yuri and Manfred have done a lot of work on Angular Elements. They especially Manfred has really stayed current with the state of Angular Elements, so he's got good resources on that. There's not much out there on the hybrid routing approach. Victor Savkin, who wrote the router in Angular, is probably the person who has written the most about the hybrid routing approach. And these are a couple years old at this point, but they're still valid. I mean, that's the nice thing about a lot of these migration resources, that even though Angular continues, I mean, the syntax of these things might change a little bit, but the approach and the principles really don't, because the AngularJS really isn't changing at all. And then beyond that, if there's anything specific, we are only at 9:45, so we've got a solid 15 minutes at least. I can happily point people in other directions. So these slides I are at samj.im/Finland. I'll work with Sean and them about sending out slides and recording and links and things like that. You can always reach out to me on Twitter at Julien, or if you go to my website, you can get on my newsletter and email me that way. But I'm definitely an open book about this migration stuff and love to share that knowledge. So that's all I got. Questions, comments?
Hey, Sam, this is Anthony. I have a question for you. When we spoke the other day, I was telling you one of our major apps right now are utilizing ng upgrade, and they're also going through a pretty big rewrite for the last 3 years. And So at the same time, so they're right now what they're trying to do is they're trying to complete the rewrite by the end of long-term support for AngularJS, right? And
Yes.
at the same time, our company is moving from a UI perspective. We're starting to move towards a web components route, web components path for component development. Do you think, like, so in your opinion, do you think it's worth rewriting the AngularJS? Because I know at the beginning you said it's one of the questions is, do you need to do this? Do you think it's worth rewriting it so it's 100% out of AngularJS before long-term support ends, or what are your thoughts on that?
So the main thing you want to think about is there ever a chance that you're going to need to write a new feature in AngularJS? That's what you really want to avoid, is a scenario where you're like, it turns out you got to add a new feature to this app, but it's 2022 and now you're trying to write a new AngularJS feature. So that's one thing. The other thing that you want to, it's all about kind of measuring risk. So the long-term support is going to end, and that means that basically, unless there's a security bug that like affects the browser, I think they're going to limit it to the browser and jQuery, like a security bug that basically breaks the internet, then they'll update AngularJS. Otherwise, they're not going to do anything. But on the flip side, they're not going to, AngularJS isn't going to be deleted from the internet next year when the long-term support ends. It's still going to be on all of the package registries and CDNs and all of those things. So, so it's all about kind of measuring your risk. I would say if there's any chance that you're going to end up doing active development on it, then I would at least get it to some sort of hybrid state where you can build a new feature in Angular. Otherwise, I think it's a matter of measuring, how critical the security bugs are.
Yep.
Does that help?
Yeah. No. Yeah. Helps a lot. Thank you. Good
Sure.
stuff.
I should also mention, I mentioned Aaron Frost and Hero Devs. Hero Devs is also going to be doing an extended long-term support for AngularJS, basically like a support contract for AngularJS. Given that the long-term support ends on July 1st of next year, I think it is, and that's just xlts.dev. And let me see, samj.im/Finland, and then I'll post in XLTS. If you end up talking to Aaron about the extended long-term support, tell him that I told you about it, since we're working together on some stuff.
Cool. Will do. That's
yeah.
awesome.
Yeah. Any other questions, concerns, resources I can point you to? Painful stories that you want to share about migration?
So speaking of painful stories, though, if anyone's going through the unit testing issues that Sam mentioned, the helper that we posted that's from Pete Bacon Darwin will help you with testing services. If you have issues testing components, whereas if, say you have a child parent component type pairing where one is AngularJS and one is Angular, and dealing with that, even mocking them out can be excessively complicated if you're not doing things properly. So I have a little pattern for doing that. If you guys want to, someone is stuck on that and they want to email me, I'm sure Sam has a pattern. I don't think there's any type of community standard at this point of how to really go about that. And I will say it's quite painful when you don't know what you're doing. The errors aren't clear about what's going wrong. Sometimes you don't even realize that you have some type of mismatch between AngularJS and Angular. But I think there are ways to get around it. I don't think it's a blocker. So I just wanted to point out that will help dramatically. The thing Pete did, it helps. It points you in the right direction for getting past components, and it makes services very simple. And so if anyone gets stuck there, just reach out. There's ways to get around it, but it is painful to start.
That's a great point. I always forget to mention that the helpers are for services. Yeah, I would if you can avoid if you can avoid testing the hybrid stuff and just try to move it over as fast as you can, then you always have to evaluate the risk of like, is it more risky to not test this, or is it more risky to spend the time building out a really complicated testing process for it? So yeah.
Especially when you know that's going to be short-lived. The solution that everyone's
Yeah.
providing is short-lived, so it doesn't really make sense to test that.
That's the thing. Yeah, you kind of have to look at the longevity. If you feel like, it's going to be in place for a couple of years, then yeah, maybe it's worth hunkering down and spending the time. But if you're trying to measure in months, not years, then maybe you just move as fast as you can and write the tests in pure Angular. Yeah. Well, cool. Sounds like that's it. Yeah, really appreciate you all. Yeah. Fada says he'd like to see your outline for unit tests, and I agree. Yeah, I think he means Sean, but yeah, I would definitely be curious to see what you ended up coming up with, Sean, for the unit tests.
Yeah, not a problem at all. Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, I can get that. I can put something small together, and with Sam's going to get us this video, and we'll have some slides, and I can put it in the meetup.com for ngPittsburgh. Does that work for everybody? Well, can we just put it there, and everybody can find that information there maybe sometime tomorrow?
Yeah. Sounds like a great idea.
Perfect. We can do that. Well, Sam, I think from all of us, we want to say thank you. I think this may have opened the door for us to do this more in the future. I think this was great. I hope everybody else enjoyed it.
Awesome. Yeah, it was a lot of fun for me. Thanks for having me. And yeah, good luck everyone. And yeah, always feel free to reach out. Even if I can't solve your exact problem, I can probably help you reason through it and maybe point you to someone smarter than me who can figure it out or something like that. Always happy to. Yeah, cool. Well, thanks everyone. Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. Much appreciated.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much.
Hope you have a great rest of your day. And yeah, we'll talk to you soon.
Right.
Cheers.
Thanks again.